The supermarket bustled with activity on a warm Tuesday afternoon. The air inside was filled with the hum of conversations, the beep of cash registers, and the faint squeak of shopping cart wheels. Greg Thompson, the store manager, stood near the front counter with his arms crossed, surveying the scene like a hawk watching over its territory. He prided himself on keeping the store under control and had little patience for what he deemed troublemakers. As he scanned the aisles, his eyes landed on an older woman, slowly making her way through the produce section. Her name, though unknown to Greg at the time, was Linda Walker. Linda was a petite black woman with silver hair tied neatly into a bun. She wore a simple beige coat and carried a worn purse that looked as if it had been through years of careful use. Greg narrowed his eyes. Something about her manner bothered him. Maybe it was the way she paused to inspect the apples one by one, or how she lingered too long near the organic lettuce. "She's probably just wasting time," he muttered to himself. Linda, oblivious to Greg's scrutiny, moved carefully from one display to another, her thoughtful demeanor revealing someone who took shopping seriously. She had a list in hand and was checking it meticulously, occasionally pausing to compare prices. Greg decided to take action. With his chest puffed out, he walked briskly toward her. "Excuse me, ma'am," he said sharply. His tone made Linda glance up, startled. "Yes," she replied politely, clutching her list. "I couldn't help but notice you've been wandering around here for a while," Greg said, his voice dripping with suspicion. "Is there something you're looking for, or are you just browsing?" Linda blinked, confused by his confrontational tone. "I'm just taking my time." "Is there a problem with that?" Greg raised an eyebrow, crossing his arms. "It's just that we've had issues in the past with people, loitering and not really buying anything." A faint murmur rippled through the aisle as nearby customers turned their heads, sensing the tension. Linda felt the weight of their stares, but she maintained her composure. "I assure you, I'm not loitering," Linda said, her voice steady but firm. "I'm here to shop just like everyone else." Greg wasn't convinced. "Well, I'll be keeping an eye on you. If you need help, you can ask, but otherwise, try not to waste too much time." Linda's cheeks flushed, not from embarrassment, but from the sheer indignity of being treated like a suspect. "I don't need your help," she said calmly, "and I don't appreciate being accused of something I haven't done." Greg didn't respond, but his gaze lingered on her as she moved toward the dairy section. As Linda continued her shopping, she couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that Greg was still watching her. His presence felt oppressive, and she noticed him making excuses to patrol the aisle she happened to be in. At the checkout, the interaction escalated. Linda placed her items, a loaf of bread, a carton of milk, and a few apples, on the conveyor belt. The young cashier, Emily Carter, smiled warmly at her, but Greg appeared at her side, leaning against the counter. "Everything in order here?" Greg asked loudly, his eyes darting toward Linda's purse as if he expected something to fall out of it. Emily hesitated, glancing at Linda with an apologetic expression. "Yes, everything's fine," she said softly. Linda's patience had worn thin, but instead of retaliating, she paid for her items in silence. She could feel the eyes of other customers on her back, some looking concerned, others merely curious. As she gathered her bag and turned to leave, Greg made one last comment. "Next time, maybe don't take so long if you're only buying a few things," he said with a smirk. Linda stopped in her tracks but didn't turn around. She took a deep breath, straightened her shoulders, and walked out the door with her dignity intact. Outside, Linda sat on a bench near the parking lot to collect herself. The humiliation stung, but she refused to let it break her. She knew who she was and what she had achieved in life, and no amount of prejudice or small-mindedness could take that away from her. As the sun began to set, casting a golden glow over the bustling parking lot, Linda rose from the bench and walked toward her car. It wasn't the newest or the fanciest, but it was hers, just like everything else she had worked so hard for. Inside the store, Greg returned to his usual routine, completely unaware of the storm he had just unleashed on himself. The following morning, Greg arrived at the supermarket early, as he always did. His routine was sacrosanct. A cup of coffee in hand, a quick check of inventory reports, and then a tour of the store before the doors opened. He liked the quiet moments before customers arrived, giving him a sense of control and calm. As he walked past the break room, he overheard hushed voices. It was Emily, the cashier from the previous day, talking to one of her colleagues. Normally, Greg would ignore such chatter, but something in Emily's tone made him pause. "I just can't believe the way he treated her," Emily said, her voice a mixture of frustration and disbelief. "Who?" asked her colleague. "The older woman from yesterday," Emily replied. "She didn't do anything wrong." But Greg was all over her like she was some sort of criminal. It was so embarrassing to watch. Greg stiffened. He didn't like being criticized, even in private. He stepped into the break room, and the conversation stopped instantly. "Good morning," Greg said, his voice icy. "Morning," Emily replied, looking anywhere but at him. "Is there something you'd like to share with me?" Greg asked, his tone challenging. Emily hesitated. "No, nothing," she said quickly, grabbing her coffee and leaving the room. Greg frowned but let it go. He didn't need to explain himself. He was the manager, and it was his job to ensure the store ran smoothly. If that meant being firm with certain customers, so be it. As the day progressed, Greg began to notice something unusual. The staff seemed quieter than usual around him, their smiles forced, and their conversation subdued when he was near. Even the regular customers who often stopped to chat appeared distant, offering only brief nods of acknowledgement. He brushed it off at first, attributing it to a busy day. But by the afternoon, the tension was undeniable. Greg found himself standing at the customer service desk when one of the assistant managers, Karen, approached him. Karen was usually cheerful and upbeat, but today her expression was serious. "Greg, can we talk for a minute?" she asked. "Of course," he said, motioning for her to continue. Karen hesitated, glancing around to ensure no one else was listening. "It's about what happened yesterday with that woman." Greg sighed, already feeling defensive. "What about it?" Karen crossed her arms. "People are talking, Greg, both staff and customers. They think you were out of line." "Out of line?" Greg scoffed. "I was doing my job." She was acting suspicious. "Suspicious how?" Karen asked, her tone skeptical. Greg faltered for a moment. She was taking too long, wandering around like she didn't have a purpose. "I've seen that kind of behavior before." Karen shook her head. "Greg, do you hear yourself? You're describing someone who was shopping, not committing a crime. And she's not just anyone, apparently." Greg raised an eyebrow. "What's that supposed to mean?" Karen sighed, lowering her voice. "I've heard a few rumors about her. People are saying she's connected, that she might even own some of the businesses around here, maybe even this one. Greg stared at her, his mind racing. "That's ridiculous," he said, though a flicker of doubt crept into his voice. "I'm just telling you what I've heard," Karen replied. "You should be careful, Greg. You might have made a mistake." Greg spent the rest of the day feeling uneasy. He tried to focus on his work, but the possibility that Linda Walker was more than she seemed gnawed at him. He found himself replaying the encounter in his mind, questioning whether he had misjudged her. By evening, the whispers had grown louder. Customers mentioned Linda by name as they checked out, and one even asked if she'd be back soon. "She's such an inspiration," one woman said to Emily at the register. "I've been following her work for years. I didn't know she shopped here." Greg overheard the comment and felt a chill run down his spine. Who exactly was Linda Walker? Later that night, Greg sat in his small office, scrolling through his phone. Curiosity had gotten the better of him, and he typed Linda Walker into the search bar. The results stunned him. Linda Walker was a well-known philanthropist and entrepreneur, celebrated for her work in revitalizing underserved communities. She had founded several successful businesses and used her wealth to support education, housing, and healthcare initiatives. Her name was synonymous with progress and empowerment. Greg stared at the screen, his heart pounding. The article he read mentioned her most recent endeavor, purchasing a chain of local supermarkets to ensure fair pricing and quality products for all customers. And there it was, in black and white. Linda Walker was the new owner of his supermarket. Greg leaned back in his chair, his face pale. The implications hit him like a freight train. The woman he had humiliated yesterday wasn't just a customer. She was his boss. For the first time in years, Greg felt a pang of genuine fear. Greg woke up the next morning with a knot in his stomach. Sleep had been elusive. Every time he closed his eyes, the image of Linda Walker's stern face haunted him. The articles he'd read about her accomplishments replayed in his mind like a broken record. She wasn't just influential. She was a force of nature. As he drove to the store, the usual rhythm of his morning routine felt foreign. His confidence, typically unshakable, had been replaced with unease. What would Linda do when she returned? Would she fire him on the spot, or would she make an example of him in front of the entire staff? The tension in the air was palpable the moment Greg stepped into the store. His employees avoided eye contact, their usual greetings replaced with murmurs and awkward silences. Greg tried to act normal, but his movements were stiff and mechanical. He headed straight for his office, hoping to find some solace in paperwork. As he reviewed the day's schedule, a knock at the door startled him. "Come in," he said, masking his anxiety with a forced calm. Karen entered, holding a stack of papers. "Morning, Greg." "Morning," he replied, not looking up. Karen hesitated, then placed the papers on his desk. "Linda Walker is expected back this afternoon," she said, her voice low. Greg's pen froze mid-signature. He looked up at Karen, trying to read her expression. Did she say why she's coming back? Karen shrugged, though her eyes betrayed a hint of sympathy. She didn't give details, just that she'd be here after lunch. "Thought you'd want to know." "Thanks," Greg muttered, dismissing her with a nod. The hours leading up to Linda's arrival were torturous. Greg replayed yesterday's encounter, wondering if there was any way to repair the damage. Should he apologize? Would it even matter? By lunchtime, Greg's nerves had reached a breaking point. He decided to step out onto the store floor, hoping that keeping busy would distract him. As he walked through the aisles, he noticed the staff whispering to one another. Some pointed in his direction, quickly looking away when he turned toward them. Greg gritted his teeth. He wasn't used to being the subject of scrutiny. Near the produce section, Emily was stocking shelves. Greg approached her cautiously, his tone unusually soft. "Emily," he said. She looked up, startled. "Yes, Mr. Hayes." "About yesterday," he began, struggling to find the right words. "I might have been too harsh on that customer. Linda, Emily interrupted, her voice firm but respectful. "You weren't just harsh, Mr. Hayes. You humiliated her. She didn't deserve that." Greg blinked, taken aback. Employees rarely spoke to him this candidly. "I understand," he said, swallowing his pride. "I made a mistake." Emily sighed, her expression softening slightly. "You should tell her that, not me." By the time the clock struck 2, Greg was stationed near the front of the store, his eyes glued to the entrance. Every time the doors slid open, his heart skipped a beat. When Linda finally walked in, dressed in the same understated manner as the day before, the air seemed to shift. Customers and employees alike turned their heads, their whispers growing louder. Linda's calm demeanor only added to her commanding presence. Greg hesitated, then approached her, his steps tentative. "Ms. Walker," he said, his voice unsteady. Linda turned to face him, her expression unreadable. "Mr. Hayes?" Greg cleared his throat, feeling the weight of everyone's eyes on him. "I'd like to apologize for my behavior yesterday. I was wrong to treat you the way I did." Linda tilted her head slightly, her gaze piercing. "And why do you think you were wrong?" Greg faltered. Because I misjudged you. I let my assumptions cloud my judgment. A flicker of something, disappointment perhaps, crossed Linda's face. "You're not apologizing because it was the right thing to do," she said evenly. "You're apologizing because you're afraid of the consequences." Greg opened his mouth to protest, but found he couldn't. Linda's words hit too close to the truth. Linda turned away, leaving Greg standing there, his apology hanging in the air. She walked toward Karen, who greeted her warmly. Together, they disappeared into the back office, leaving Greg to stew in his regret. For the rest of the day, Greg was a shadow of himself. He moved through his tasks mechanically, each interaction with his employees strained and awkward. The whispers continued, and the weight of their judgment was suffocating. When Linda finally emerged from the office hours later, Greg felt a surge of dread. She approached him, her steps measured and deliberate. "Mr. Hayes," she said, her tone formal, "I'll be conducting a full review of the store's management practices. In the meantime, I suggest you reflect on how your actions impact not just the customers, but your staff as well." Greg nodded stiffly, his throat dry. "Understood." Linda's gaze lingered on him for a moment before she turned and left the store. As the automatic doors slid shut behind her, Greg felt an overwhelming sense of relief, but it was fleeting. He knew this wasn't over. The next few days at the store were a whirlwind of changes. Linda Walker's presence seemed to linger even in her absence. Greg felt as though her watchful eyes were everywhere, scrutinizing his every move. Karen informed him that Linda had scheduled a formal review of all management practices, which only deepened Greg's anxiety. She had also requested anonymous surveys from the employees about their experiences under his leadership. The very idea made Greg's stomach churn. More than ever, he began to notice the tension in his staff. The once quiet grumbles were now unmistakable, and Greg realized how much damage he had done, not just to Linda but to everyone who worked under him. He had been so consumed by maintaining control and asserting authority that he had never considered the ripple effects of his actions. But the hardest part was the self-reflection that came with it. For the first time, Greg started to question the kind of person he had become. It was late one evening, long after the store had closed, when Greg sat alone in his office. The dim light from his desk lamp cast long shadows on the walls, mirroring the weight of his thoughts. On his desk lay a printed report of Linda's biography, which he had read so many times that the paper was crinkled and worn. Linda's journey was remarkable, a story of resilience, determination, and unwavering principles. She had risen from humble beginnings to become a successful entrepreneur, breaking barriers and challenging stereotypes along the way. Greg couldn't help but feel a pang of guilt. He had spent his career climbing the corporate ladder, but at what cost? He had sacrificed empathy, fairness, and respect for a sense of power that now felt hollow. He stared at the phone on his desk, debating whether to call Linda. Every fiber of his being told him that he needed to make things right, not just because of the consequences he feared, but because he owed her and himself a genuine apology. The next morning, Greg arrived at the store earlier than usual. The parking lot was empty, and the silence was almost comforting. As he stepped inside, he noticed Karen already at her desk. "Karen," he said, approaching her cautiously. She looked up, surprised to see him so early. "Good morning, Greg. Everything okay? I need to ask you something," he said, lowering his voice. "Do you have Linda Walker's direct contact information?" Karen raised an eyebrow. "I do, but why?" Greg hesitated, unsure of how much to reveal. "I need to talk to her. Privately. I need to apologize properly." Karen studied him for a moment before nodding. "I'll send you her number. But if you're serious about this, Greg, you need to be sincere. She doesn't have time for empty words." "I understand," he said, his tone somber. Later that afternoon, Greg sat in his office, the phone in his hand. He had rehearsed what he would say a dozen times, but his nerves refused to settle. Finally, he took a deep breath and dialed the number Karen had given him. The line rang twice before a calm, familiar voice answered. "Linda Walker speaking." "Ms. Walker, this is Greg Hayes," he began, his voice tight with apprehension. "I hope I'm not interrupting." There was a pause on the other end before Linda replied, her tone measured. "Mr. Hayes, to what do I owe this call?" Greg swallowed hard. "I wanted to apologize. Properly this time. What I did was inexcusable, and I realize now how much harm I caused, not just to you, but to everyone here. I've been reflecting a lot since our encounter, and I see now that I've been blind to my own flaws." Linda didn't respond immediately, and the silence felt deafening. Greg wondered if she was about to hang up. "I appreciate the effort," Linda said finally, her voice calm but firm. "But words alone won't fix this, Mr. Hayes. If you truly regret your actions, show it. Change how you lead. Treat people with respect, regardless of who they are or where they come from." Greg nodded, even though she couldn't see him. "I will," he said earnestly. "I know it'll take time, but I'm committed to doing better." Linda's tone softened slightly. Then start by listening to your employees. They're the heart of the store, not you. Remember that." "I will," Greg repeated, his voice filled with resolve. After the call, Greg felt a mix of relief and determination. He knew this was just the beginning of a long road toward redemption, but for the first time, he felt ready to take that journey. That evening, he called a meeting with his management team and staff. It wasn't easy standing before them, knowing how many bridges he had burned, but he spoke from the heart. "I've made mistakes," he admitted, his voice steady but sincere. "And I've let my ego get in the way of what's truly important: respect, fairness, and the well-being of this team. I'm committed to earning back your trust, one step at a time." The room was silent, and Greg couldn't tell if his words had resonated. But he didn't expect forgiveness overnight. He would prove himself through his actions, just as Linda had advised. As the meeting ended and the employees filed out, Greg noticed Emily lingering near the door. She gave him a small, hesitant nod before leaving, and it felt like the first step toward mending the damage he had caused. The days following Greg's apology were filled with a mixture of tension and tentative hope. While some of his employees were skeptical, others were cautiously optimistic that this was a turning point. Greg knew that he couldn't expect to earn their trust overnight, but he was committed to proving that he could change. It wasn't easy. His leadership style, once strict and authoritative, had to transform into something more collaborative and empathetic. Greg had always been about efficiency and control, but now he had to learn how to balance that with compassion and openness. Every decision he made seemed to weigh heavier, but he was determined not to fall back into old habits. One afternoon, while Greg was reviewing a sales report in his office, Karen knocked and entered with a concerned expression. She hesitated for a moment before speaking. "Greg," she started softly, "there's someone here to see you. She says it's urgent." Greg looked up from his papers, a frown forming on his face. "Who is it?" "Linda Walker," Karen replied, her tone neutral. "She's here." Greg's heart skipped a beat. He hadn't expected to see Linda in person so soon after their phone call. He felt a mix of nervousness and anticipation as he stood up. "Send her in, please," Greg said, trying to keep his voice steady. A few moments later, Linda walked into his office. Her presence was calm but commanding, as always. She wore a simple, elegant outfit, but there was an air of authority about her that couldn't be ignored. She extended her hand to Greg, who shook it firmly, but there was a softness in her eyes that told him she wasn't here for confrontation. "Good afternoon, Mr. Hayes," Linda greeted him, her voice warm but purposeful. "I wanted to come by and see for myself how things are going." Greg swallowed, feeling a lump form in his throat. "I appreciate you taking the time to come, Ms. Walker. I've been trying to make things right, but I know it's a long road ahead." Linda smiled faintly, sitting down in the chair across from him. "I can see that you're trying, Greg, and that's important, but actions speak louder than words." "I know," Greg replied, his voice thick with sincerity. "I've been working on it, listening to the team more, being more transparent. It's not easy, but I'm committed to it." Linda studied him for a moment, as though evaluating his every word. After a few seconds, she nodded. "That's good to hear," she said, her tone thoughtful. "But I need to see more. I need to see that you're truly invested in this, not just for yourself, but for everyone who works here. You've got a lot of power, Greg, and power can either build up or tear down. The choice is yours." Greg felt a weight settle on his shoulders as he nodded. He understood exactly what she meant. She wasn't here to coddle him, and she wasn't going to let him off the hook easily. But that was what he needed. Tough love. And it would take more than just a few apologies to make amends. "I understand," Greg said quietly, his voice full of resolve. "I'll do whatever it takes." Linda gave him a final, searching look before standing up. "I'll be watching Greg," she said, her eyes locking with his. "But I believe in second chances. Don't waste it." As she left his office, Greg sat back in his chair, her words echoing in his mind. He knew that Linda wasn't just talking about his management style. She was talking about his character, his integrity. He had to change not just for the job, but for himself. The following weeks were a blur of small victories and setbacks. Greg made it a point to have one-on-one meetings with each of his employees, listening to their concerns, offering apologies where necessary, and asking for feedback. The atmosphere in the store began to shift, albeit slowly. Some employees warmed up to him. Others remained cautious, but all of them respected the effort he was putting into making things better. One afternoon, as Greg was leaving for the day, he bumped into Emily, who was walking out of the back room. She paused, looking at him with a mixture of hesitation and curiosity. "Greg, can we talk?" she asked. Greg nodded, a little surprised but willing. "Of course, Emily. What's on your mind?" Emily glanced around, making sure no one else was nearby before speaking. "I wanted to thank you," she said, her voice soft. "I know I wasn't the first person to trust you, but I've noticed a difference in the way you handle things now. You're listening. You're trying." Greg was taken aback by her words. Emily, who had been one of his harshest critics, was acknowledging his efforts. "I appreciate that, Emily," he said, his voice sincere. "I know I have a long way to go, but I'm committed to doing better, and I'll keep trying. If you ever feel like I'm slipping, call me out on it. I need people to hold me accountable." Emily smiled, the tension easing from her shoulders. "I will. I'm just glad to see the change, Greg." As she walked away, Greg felt a small sense of accomplishment, but he knew it wasn't enough to rest on. Linda had been right. His actions had to speak louder than his words. But for the first time in a long while, he believed he was on the right path. Weeks passed, and Greg's efforts were slowly starting to show. The atmosphere in the store was less tense. Employees seemed more relaxed, and there were even moments of laughter between them. But Greg knew he had not yet proven himself completely. The hardest test was still to come. Linda Walker's words still echoed in his mind. Actions speak louder than words. One late afternoon, as the store was preparing to close, Greg walked through the aisles, making his usual rounds to ensure everything was running smoothly. He noticed something unusual. There was a commotion at the front register. He quickened his pace, instinctively sensing that something wasn't right. As he got closer, he saw Karen, the cashier, speaking in a low but firm voice to an elderly woman. The woman was bent over her shopping cart, holding a few items, her face tense with frustration. Greg could tell that Karen was trying to keep the situation under control, but it wasn't working. The elderly woman seemed upset, her hands shaking slightly as she fumbled through her purse. "What's going on here?" Greg asked as he approached. Karen turned to him, her face a little pale. "She's trying to pay, but the card keeps getting declined. I told her we can't accept the items unless she can pay. She's really upset, and I don't think it's just about the card." Greg glanced at the elderly woman, Her face creased with age, and there was a sadness in her eyes that struck him. Without hesitation, he stepped forward, smiling warmly. "Ma'am, I'm Greg Hayes, the manager here. How can I help?" The woman looked up at him, blinking in surprise. She seemed hesitant to speak, but Greg could see the weight of frustration and helplessness in her posture. It's nothing, young man," she said, her voice trembling. "I'm just trying to buy some food for the week, but my card is giving me trouble. It's been like this all day. I don't know what to do." Greg's eyes softened. He could sense the deeper layers of her frustration. It wasn't just a card issue. It was the weight of a system that had failed her over and over again. The elderly woman was being reduced to a statistic, another forgotten person who struggled to make ends meet. "Let me take care of this for you," Greg said quickly. "We'll work through this together. Don't worry about it." He turned to Karen. "Please put her items through. I'll cover the cost." Karen hesitated for a moment, but then nodded, relieved by Greg's decision. As Greg swiped his own card to cover the woman's groceries, he noticed her still looking at him with a mix of disbelief and gratitude. She opened her mouth to protest, but Greg raised his hand gently. "You don't need to say anything. Just let me help." The woman nodded, unable to hide the tears that welled up in her eyes. It was clear she had been struggling for far too long, and now someone had finally taken the time to see her. She was no longer just another customer. She was a person, deserving of dignity and respect. After the transaction was complete, Greg looked at her with sincerity. "I hope this helps. Is there anything else I can do?" The woman shook her head, still wiping away her tears, but she smiled warmly. Thank you so much. God bless you, son." Greg smiled back, a sense of peace settling over him. It wasn't about the money. It wasn't about making a big gesture to prove something. It was about acknowledging someone's humanity, something he had forgotten to do in the past. As the woman left the store, Greg felt a sudden weight in his chest. He wasn't done changing. He wasn't done learning. But this moment, this was a small victory. It was a step in the right direction. He'd promised Linda Walker that he would prove himself through action, and this was a start. Later that evening, as Greg sat in his office, reflecting on the events of the day, he received a phone call from an unknown number. He hesitated for a moment before answering. "Greg Hayes speaking," he said. "Greg, it's Linda Walker." Greg sat up straight, surprised by the call. "Linda, how are you?" "I'm doing well, thank you," she replied, her voice calm and collected. "I just wanted to check in. How are things going with the team?" Greg paused, collecting his thoughts. "I'm doing my best, Linda. I know I'm not perfect, but I'm trying. I made a decision today. Helped an elderly woman with her groceries when her card wasn't working. It wasn't much, but I hope it made a difference." Linda's voice softened. "It sounds like you're beginning to understand what really matters." "That's good to hear, Greg. Keep it up. But remember, you have a long way to go. The road to real change is never smooth." Greg nodded, though Linda couldn't see him. "I know, and I'm ready for it." "Good," she said, her tone firm yet encouraging. "I believe you can do it, Greg. Just don't forget why you started." As the call ended, Greg sat back in his chair, reflecting on the weight of Linda's words. Change wasn't easy, but it was possible. He had to keep pushing forward. He had to keep doing the work, even when it felt impossible. The next morning, Greg arrived at the store early, ready to face whatever challenges the day would bring. But as he walked through the aisles, he noticed something different. The employees seemed to be looking at him with a new sense of respect, even admiration. They were still skeptical, but there was a glimmer of hope in their eyes. They were beginning to see the change. And for the first time in a long while, Greg felt like he was on the right path. The days following Greg's encounter with the elderly woman seemed to weigh on him more heavily than he had anticipated. He had made progress, yes, but there was a sense that he was on the edge of something much larger, something that could either build him up or break him down entirely. His interactions with Linda Walker echoed in his mind. You still have a long way to go. The morning after, Greg was in the middle of overseeing a routine inventory check when he noticed a familiar face of Linda Walker in the store. She was standing near the produce section, examining the fruit with an air of calm authority that had always made him feel a little nervous in the past. She wasn't there on a formal visit. She had come to observe his progress, as she often did. Greg felt his pulse quicken as he walked toward her, trying to steady himself. He knew that she would see right through him, whether or not he was truly changing. "Good morning, Linda," he greeted her, his voice a little shakier than he wanted it to be. She smiled warmly, but with a hint of concern. "Good morning, Greg. How's everything going?" He hesitated, rubbing the back of his neck. "Better, I think, but I'm not sure if it's enough yet." Linda gave him a pointed look, her gaze steady. "You're doubting yourself again, Greg. It's okay to question, but don't let that self-doubt hold you back. You're doing more than you realize. You've already taken a big step by opening yourself to change." Greg swallowed, trying to process her words. He had never been one to show his vulnerabilities, but in the last few weeks, something in him had shifted. He had started to listen more, to the people around him, to his own conscience, to Linda's no-nonsense guidance. But despite that, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was walking a tightrope, ready to fall at any moment. As they continued to walk through the aisles, Greg's eyes wandered to the shelves, but his mind was elsewhere, caught up in his insecurities. He couldn't deny the tension that lingered in the air between him and the staff. It wasn't overt, but he could feel it, a subtle distance. They were still skeptical of him, still unsure whether he was truly capable of changing. He could hear their whispers, the hushed conversations behind his back. And then, just as they reached the back of the store, something happened that would push Greg to his breaking point. One of the employees, Marcus, a young man who had always been quiet and reserved, approached them with an air of unease. His face was flushed, his hands fidgeting with the edge of his apron. "Greg," he began, his voice uncertain, "there's an issue. One of the regular customers, she's here, and she's making a scene." Greg turned to Linda, who raised an eyebrow but remained silent, letting him take the lead. He nodded to Marcus, signaling for him to show him what was going on. They made their way to the front of the store, and as soon as Greg saw the woman in question, his stomach dropped. It was Ms. Johnson, an elderly regular customer who had been a fixture of the store for years. She was known for her sharp tongue and her tendency to challenge anyone who seemed to disrespect her. But today, she was beyond angry. She was livid. She was yelling at another employee, Marissa, the new cashier who had been working there for only a few months. Greg's heart raced as he approached them. "Ms. Johnson, what's going on?" he asked, trying to keep his voice calm. She whirled around, glaring at him. "What's going on is that your new employee treated me like I was beneath her. She refused to honor my coupon and then had the nerve to talk down to me, like I didn't know the rules. I've been shopping here for years, and now she's treating me like I'm some kind of criminal. Greg glanced at Marissa, who looked terrified, her eyes wide as she stood frozen behind the counter. She was shaking, clearly afraid of what Ms. Johnson might do next. "Ms. Johnson, I apologize for the misunderstanding," Greg said, his tone steady but firm. "I'll take care of it right now. Marissa, you can step aside." But as he tried to calm the situation, the woman's fury only escalated. "No, you don't get it, Greg," Ms. Johnson snapped, her voice filled with an edge of bitterness that Greg hadn't expected. "I've seen what's happening here. You've been putting on a show, trying to act like you're some kind of hero, but nothing's changed. You think I don't see the way you've been treating people, the way you've been pretending to care? You think I'm just going to forget that?" The words hit Greg like a slap in the face. The facade he'd been building, the progress he'd been so proud of, was crumbling right in front of him. His chest tightened, and for a brief moment, he didn't know how to respond. Ms. Johnson was right in some ways. He had tried to do better, but it didn't change the fact that his past actions had left scars that couldn't be healed overnight. Linda, who had been silently observing from the sidelines, stepped forward at that moment. Her voice was calm, yet filled with an authority that demanded attention. "Greg," she said gently, "this is part of the journey. You can't expect everything to be fixed with a few good deeds. People see your efforts, but that doesn't mean they'll forget your mistakes right away." Greg nodded, his eyes lowered. He knew Linda was right. He couldn't undo the years of prejudice, of arrogance, with a simple change of heart. It was going to take time, patience, and a whole lot more than just a few kind gestures. But in that moment, he made a decision. He wasn't going to give up. He wasn't going to let one setback define him. He looked back at Ms. Johnson, his voice firm yet empathetic. "Ms. Johnson," he began, "I'm sorry for how you've been treated. I know that my actions in the past have hurt you, and I can't take that back. But I want you to know that I'm working hard to change, and I'm not going to stop trying until I get it right. I can't promise everything will be perfect, but I promise I'll keep doing better." The room fell silent. Ms. Johnson's glare softened slightly, but she still looked at him with suspicion. However, she didn't say anything more. After a long pause, she turned to leave, her posture a little less rigid but still distant. Greg let out a deep breath, the weight of the moment hanging in the air. As she walked out of the store, he felt a mixture of relief and uncertainty. The path ahead was still unclear, but he had taken another step forward. He wasn't perfect, but he was trying. The following weeks were a blur for Greg. Each day felt like a new test, and the weight of his past decisions hung heavily over him, like a shadow that he couldn't quite outrun. But it wasn't just the weight of his actions that gnawed at him. It was a persistent, nagging feeling that he was being watched, that every step he took, every choice he made, was being scrutinized not just by his employees, but by Linda Walker. Despite his progress, there were still moments when the old Greg resurfaced, moments when he wanted to revert to his old ways, to retreat into the comfort of his former arrogance and superiority. But with each passing day, he reminded himself of what he was striving for, a future where he could look himself in the mirror without flinching. One morning, as Greg arrived at work early to prepare for the day, he found Linda already there. She was standing at the entrance, her arms crossed, as though waiting for him. "Good morning, Linda," he greeted, trying to keep his voice neutral, though he couldn't quite hide the weariness in his tone. She turned toward him, her eyes sharp, but her smile was kind. "Morning, Greg. How are you feeling today?" "Better," he replied, offering a small but sincere smile. It's been a tough road, but I'm starting to believe in this change. In myself, Linda nodded, her gaze never leaving him. That's good to hear. But remember, it's not just about the words. It's about consistency. It's about what you do when no one's looking. Greg's heart sank a little. She was right. He knew that deep down. He had made progress. Yes, but it was far from being enough. He hadn't fully earned the respect he sought, and perhaps more importantly, he hadn't truly made amends for his past actions. The clock was ticking, and every day felt like a countdown to the moment when his efforts would either pay off or unravel completely. As the day wore on, the store was busy with customers, and Greg fell into the rhythm of managing the operations, making sure everything ran smoothly. But in the back of his mind, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was going to happen, something that would force him to confront everything he had been avoiding. Around midday, the moment arrived. It started with a simple conversation in the break room between Greg and Marcus. The young man had come to ask Greg about the schedule, but there was a tension in the air, a subtle unease that Greg could feel but couldn't quite explain. "Greg, there's something you need to know," Marcus said, his voice low. "Some of the other employees, they're talking about you." Greg's stomach tightened. He didn't need to hear it. He already knew. He could feel the whispers, the skepticism lingering in the corners of the store. He'd known it wouldn't be easy, but hearing it from Marcus, someone he had grown to respect, made it real. "What are they saying?" Greg asked, trying to keep his tone calm. Marcus hesitated before responding. "They don't know if you're really changing. They don't know if you're just doing this because of Linda or if you actually mean it. Some of them still don't trust you." Greg let out a long, slow breath. The truth hit him harder than he expected. He had known it was coming, but the reality of it stung. He had spent so much time trying to convince others of his growth, but in the end, it was his own actions that would determine whether they believed him. Before he could respond, the door to the break room opened, and Linda walked in. Her eyes scanned the room quickly before she turned her attention to Greg, her expression serious. "I need to talk to you," she said, her voice firm. Greg stood up, his heart pounding. He followed Linda to her office, his mind racing. Was this it? Was this the moment when everything would come crashing down? As soon as the door clicked shut behind them, Linda spoke. "You know what they're saying, don't you?" she asked, her tone not accusatory but calm measured. Greg nodded, a heavy weight settling in his chest. "Yes, I'm aware." Linda studied him for a moment, her gaze unwavering. "Then what are you going to do about it?" He opened his mouth, but no words came out. What could he say? His past had caught up with him, and now the real challenge was here, proving that his transformation wasn't just some fleeting attempt. He had to prove to his employees, to Linda, and most importantly to himself, that he was capable of genuine change. "I've been trying," he finally said, his voice quieter than he intended. "But I guess I still have a long way to go." Linda stepped closer to him, her eyes softening. "You do, and you will. But remember, Greg, change isn't just about making the right moves in the moment. It's about how you react when you're tested. When the pressure is on, that's when you show who you really are." Greg looked up at her, the weight of her words sinking in. This wasn't going to be easy. There would be more tests, more challenges. But he couldn't back down now. He had come too far. As they walked back into the main area of the store, Greg was greeted by the sight of his employees at work. The atmosphere had shifted slightly. There was a quiet wariness, but also something else, a hint of respect. It wasn't much, but it was a start. Later that day, as the store was winding down, Greg sat at his desk, reflecting on the journey that had brought him here. He thought back to the moments that had led to this point, the humiliation of Linda, the conversation with Marcus, the constant battle to prove that he was more than just the man he once was. And then he remembered Linda's words. It's about consistency. It's about what you do when no one's looking. He smiled softly to himself. He wasn't done yet, but he was getting there.